Good evening, ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties. This is Alex coming at you from the underworld, and welcome back to another episode of This weekend. I've selected another book from the massive TBR that I had created for myself nearly 2 years ago. Which I hate to admit that I hadn't been able to knock out that TBR sooner, but as the saying goes, better late than never. Which luckily I only have one more book after this one, and then that TBR is done completely. So I'm really excited to say that the next to last book I'm reviewing on that list is the splatterpunk classic The Rats by James Herbert, which this had been recommended to me by the viewer Mark Lind. And before I get started, I would just like to note that in previous videos, I've said that I've wanted to read more horror where animals rebel against humans. But unfortunately, all I've read up until now has just been some books about sea creatures attacking people and also the infamous novel Cows by Matthew Stocko. So, since I haven't been able to really expand in that subgenre, I was really happy to finally start this book. Also, even though I'm not an expert when it comes down to animal-based horror, I've noticed out of the books I've read this far, the subgenre can get very political, and it can focus a great deal on classism. Which, even though I'm surprised to see these subjects, I'm not complaining because I feel like it's really enlightened me and it's enhanced my reading experience. Aside from that, I buddy read this with my good online friend Hanny, which, as always, I enjoyed the crazy ride that we had together, but I do find it funny that when we first met, she explained that she was really squeamish when it came down to gore. And I'm really happy that she's come more so over to my side because The Rats is a book that drips with literal viscera. Anywho, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank Hanny for buddy reading this with me, and I would like to thank Mark Lynn for his recommendation. Now, without me rambling on anymore, let's head off to the London slums and see what horrors are hiding in the old abandoned house by the canal. The Rats by James Herbert opens up presenting multiple troubled characters who all live in poverty. And every time an underdog has the potential to rise above, their likelihood is cut short when they're confronted by an army of bloodthirsty rats. Then, as the book progresses, these attacks go from being isolated to becoming more widespread. Which this is when we're introduced to the unlikely protagonist named Harris, who goes from being an elementary school teacher to standing on the front lines with exterminators and health administrators. But as their attempts to eliminate the rats in their entirety yield poor results, Harris comes face to face with unspeakable horrors where he discovers that humankind only have themselves to blame. In 1974, James Herbert published his debut novel, The Rats. Following its success, this splatterpunk novel would later produce multiple sequels, such as Lair, Domain, and the out-of-print graphic novel, The City. Originally, Herbert wrote The Rats as a pastime. Even still, while creating, he had been inspired by the scene in Todd Browning's Dracula when Renfield described his nightmares about rats. Another contributing inspiration was Herbert's own childhood, as he had grown up in a slum that had to be demolished. In an interview for The Observer, Herbert told Andrew Billen that the subtext of The Rats focused on successive government's neglect of London's East End, where he had grown up. And while this book can be read and enjoyed as schlock horror, he filled its pages with metaphor and subtext. Herbert later revealed that he had written two sequels to The Rats, because he felt that the characters who were responsible for what happened had to be wiped out. Fun facts! For those of you who are curious, here's how people responded after The Rats was published. Although the first edition of The Rats sold out within 3 weeks, it received a great deal of criticism for being too graphic and extreme with its sex and violence. Following its release, Herbert went into his local W.H. Smith's and asked if they had the book. They replied no, and nor were they likely to shelve it. Despite the criticisms the Rats garnished, over the years, authors like Ramsey Campbell and Neil Gaiman have praised Herbert's work, where Gaiman said, "Herbert created a whole subgenre of fiction." In an interview conducted by Johnny Maines for Fear and the Paperback Fanatic, Herbert explained, "I think you could call all of my books morality plays, even the earlier ones. But, of course, no one realized that because they were all focused on the horror and violence." James Herbert passed away in 2013 in his home in Sussex. He was reported to have not been ill. Well, now that we have that covered, it's time to move on to the spoiler segment, which, if you haven't read this book before, I'm about to reveal some things that could ruin the experience for you. So if you would like to click away, just scroll down to the comments and you'll see that I have a pinned comment at the top with the timestamp in it. Once you click that timestamp, it will direct you away from the spoilers and bring you to the thoughts section. Now, you only have 17 seconds to do this, so ready, set, go! Since everyone's had the opportunity to click away, I would like to talk about a few of my favorite moments. First up is the bloodbath in the subway. Now, prior to this, the rat attacks had seemed like they had been fairly isolated. Yet, on a day that infamously becomes known as Black Monday, these attacks start becoming more widespread. So, to kick off one of the worst Mondays to ever exist, we open up with a guy named Dave who's standing on a platform waiting for his train. But while he's waiting, he starts to hear this weird sound coming from the distant tunnel. And as he becomes more curious, he discovers the sound is being caused by a few million rats that are running towards him. Unfortunately, before he can haul ass, the rats attack him and carry him away. Then, while this is going down, a worker who had seen everything tries to escape by running off down the tracks. However, he doesn't actually make it very far because he's met head-on by a train where he makes a pretty decent splat. But adding on to this bloodbath, the train mows down all of the rats that had been chasing him. But wait, there's more, because after the train screeches to a stop, it loses all of its juice due to everything that it just hit. So, since the passengers aren't going anywhere and the conductor smells smoke, he thinks he's going to lead everyone to safety through the subway. But before he can gather anyone up, the train catches on fire and the rats attack, where just about everyone is ripped to shreds and eaten alive. Y'all, this took me by surprise because I was not expecting a sequence this intense this early on in the book. Like, because of what happens, I would think this would be a grand finale scene, but no. Herbert totally threw a curveball when I was not expecting it, and every time I thought that the moment would be over, it just kept going and going and going. But the weird thing is, Herbert really didn't overdo it with the blood and guts and gore. I mean, he got the point across, and he definitely made me feel like I was on the edge of my seat. But what happened was, after I had read this, I was like, okay, what other tricks does he have up his sleeve? What's he gonna do next? So I honestly kept reading just to see how he was going to top himself. And while I was reading this whole sequence, all I could think was, yeah, this is how hell is, because the characters are trapped underground, the train is on fire, they're being eaten alive by rats, and complete pandemonium is going down around them. So, yeah, I am not wanting to go on a subway anytime soon. My next favorite moment was the schoolyard scene, which at this point, it's still early in the day, and Harris is in his classroom speaking to a student when a young boy runs in screaming that there are huge rats on the playground. And when Harris goes to check this out, he does see a handful of rats out there. However, in the blink of an eye, these few rodents increase to a very intimidating number. Upon seeing the shit that's about to go down, Harris rescues the remaining child that's outside. Then he runs in and starts yelling for everyone to secure the windows while he's trying to make the building safe. And in the meantime, he is actually able to kill off a few rats with the fire poker. Then, all of a sudden, the headmaster comes up to him and brings to his attention the basement where the janitor is. And of course, when they go check on the janitor, they see that the basement is full of rats and he's been eaten alive. Well, after emergency arrives, Harris and the headmaster are still kicking some pretty good ass. And this is when the fire truck floods out the basement so they can drown the rats that are trapped down there. And after they do this, they're able to gas the lower level of the school, and this is done with a fume that's not harmful to human beings. Y'all, not since the birds had I encountered a scene like this. And as I read, I wondered if this was Herbert paying his respects to the Hitchcock classic. Regardless, if that was the case or not, this scene was a pure adrenaline rush for me because I really thought quite a few kids were going to die. Also, to be perfectly honest, even though Harris had been the lead character for the last 5 or 6 chapters, due to the potential leads that had died off up to this moment, I didn't know if Herbert was going to pull one on me and just yank the rug out from under my feet. My final favorite moment was the showdown between Harris and the head rat. Now, before this happened, it had been established that a professor named Schiller had spent a few years in New Guinea and the surrounding islands, where he studied mutant animals that had been the result of radiation. Afterwards, he had relocated to London and moved into the house by the canal. And while he resided here, he experimented on a mutant rat that he had smuggled over with him from his travels. And he allowed that rat to breed so he could study it further. So, on the day of the grand finale, Harris finds out that a government official by the name of Foskins has gone to Schiller's house because he believes that's where the nest is, and he wants to try to redeem himself for not doing more sooner. Well, since Harris is determined to be the hero of the day, he goes after Foskins. But as he's driving to that house, he sees the streets are flooded with nothing but rats. Then, after a pretty intense attack on his car, Harris finally does make it to the house where he eventually goes into the basement, which we discover that the basement is actually the feeding ground of the rats. From here, he encounters Foskin's dead body, which the rats are still feeding on, and this is when he gets attacked. And even though this seems like this is going to be the end of the line for him, he does some pretty serious hacking with an axe that Foskins had died holding. Upon kicking some major ass, Harris starts to hear this weird mewing sound in the corner of the basement. And after he goes to see what this is, he comes face to face with the boss rat. And it is every bit as grotesque as you can imagine. Like, it is hairless, it has 2 heads, there's these bulging veins all over it, and to add the cherry on the cake, it smells so bad, its odor is practically toxic. And it's so obese, it can't even move. So, upon Harris having this confrontation, he understands that if he doesn't kill the boss rat, people are going to want to experiment with it and study it, which this could lead to even more horrors than what they're already experiencing. Y'all, the reveal of the boss rat was a great payoff for this book, because up until this moment, I really thought that the boss rat was just going to be your basic huge rat. But no, The author totally went there and made it this grotesque monstrosity. And had I been in that basement and saw that, I would have ran like hell and just burnt the whole place down. And this is coming from someone who thinks that everything in the rodent family is absolutely adorable. May it be a mouse, a gerbil, a hamster, or even a rat. But no. Hell no. This was pure nightmare fuel. I would like to take this opportunity to bitch about a group of dipshits. So while everyone's running around wondering what in the hell to do about Templeton and his friends, some dumbass researcher is like, hey, I have a plan. Let's get these fluffy little kittens and puppies and load them up with a deadly disease, then feed them to the rats while they're still alive. And you want to know what happens next? Some asshole biochemist is like, you know what? I think I know just the disease. Y'all, I know these assholes don't know what in the hell they're doing and they're grasping at straws, but what kind of a sick pervert suggests that we load up puppies and kittens with a deadly disease and feed them to the rats while we stand back and watch? Like, that is some sick, barbaric shit. Instead, why not just get some dickweed politician who's been making the poor poor and the rich richer and serve him up instead? I mean, personally, I would sleep a whole hell of a lot better at night knowing that Garfield and Odie are well taken care of, while some soulless politician is having his raisins nibbled away. Like, if there was ever a moment where Eat the Rich should apply, it was this. The Rats by James Herbert was a relentless splatterpunk novel that focused on subjects like poverty, the government, and nuclear fears. Not to mention, we were provided with a wide range of characters, where every time I thought we would have a hero or heroine, I later discovered that they were simply nothing more than a side dish. Character-wise, before an actual protagonist was established, there were a couple of characters who I thought the book would follow from beginning to end. Instead, I came to realize this was Herbert just giving us examples of everyday people who lived on the outskirts of society because they had been thrown away and not cared for. Now, out of these characters, I really felt sorry for Mary and Henry because while at one time they had been happy, to see that happiness get yanked away from them, that was just heartbreaking. And because of that sudden twist of fate, we saw where they did make some poor decisions, and life in general didn't make things any better. And of course, because of them being in the place that they were, society didn't do anything more to help them. Which this comments really greatly on how society dismisses those who don't fit into their mold of conformity. Theme-wise, this book focuses a great deal on poverty, and because of what happens to the Mary character, we see that poverty can create crime, as people who live in poverty don't have the same benefits as those who are financially stable when it comes down to assistance. And because of them being dismissed, this can lead to untreated depression, mental illness, substance abuse, violence, and a lot more. Also, this subject is presented by how the government ignores poverty-stricken areas and the repercussions of them turning a blind eye. Which this is seen the most when the rats gather in the filthiest places of London, which just so happen to be residential areas that the government has allowed to progressively get worse. And because of how this plays out, we see that the government only tries to take control when things get out of hand. But, of course, by then, the damage has already been done. And while I'm on the subject of the government, this book also shows that society eventually has to take matters into their own hands and decide what's best for their own well-being. Which this is indicated when Harris confronts the boss rat and he realizes that he has to kill it, because if he doesn't, the government's going to want to study it and conduct experiments, which could lead to another outbreak. Now, even though I haven't had anything good to say about the government in this book, Herbert does present a character by the name of Foskins who tries to redeem himself because he feels like he should have done something sooner. And because of what he does, we see that he's not working on a governmental chain of command. Instead, he's working on pure human emotions. Another subject this book focuses on is nuclear fears, which, as Hanny and I were talking about this, she felt like Herbert used this book to purge himself of Cold War trauma. And to be honest, I completely agree, especially since Herbert had used this book as an opportunity to comment on the poverty he experienced during his childhood. Now, to give a good example of nuclear fears, this is seen when we discover that the rats are actually the offspring of mutants that had been transformed due to nuclear radiation. And since rats represent death, I think Herbert focusing on rats as his subject was a good call because it really allowed me to focus on how one isolated incident could become an epidemic. And while Herbert doesn't beat us over the head with warfare in this volume, I think that he did a great job of presenting a ripple effect where we could see how nuclear warfare could cause damage for the long haul. The Rats by James Herbert didn't scare me, creep me out, or gross me out. However, even though this book didn't gross me out, it might be a little too much for some, especially if you can't take child death, animal death, or even graphic violence. The Rats by James Herbert was a great reminder that if something goes horribly wrong in the animal kingdom or with Mother Nature, humankind only have themselves to blame. And while I had intended to read this book and move on to something completely different, the world that Herbert had built was something that I became so invested in, I immediately moved on to the second book in this series, which is Layer. And obviously, that should let you know what my next book review is going to be on. But at the end of the day, if you are looking for a relentless splatterpunk novel that features man versus beast while it comments on London's political issues during that time, then I do highly recommend The Rats. Now that we've reached the end of this video, I would just like to thank these amazing people for contributing to my Patreon account. As you can tell, some of the names listed here are creators, so be sure to check out their work. And if you would like to contribute to my Patreon account, I have a link available in the description section of this episode. So if you're able to contribute, that's awesome. If not, no sweat. I just hope you return to this channel so we can have a good time together. Also, if you would like to hit me up on social media, links to my Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram are all available in the description section of this episode. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, be sure to subscribe and click that notifications bell because I do have more book reviews coming in the near future. So until we see each other again, I hope you have a great week and sweet nightmares.